and welcome back from our lunch break. It's fantastic seeing everybody playing their first capture the flags. I know a lot of you, it's not the first time you've done it before, but we've seen so many people posting up that this is the first time they were able to capture a flag, and they're doing it via Jupiter rockets or boot up, and it's really, really awesome to see that. So congratulations if you are playing your first game and you're capturing flags. That's awesome. And watching folks just blast their way through Jupiter rockets and pivoting and all that fun stuff. So just a fantastic, and keep going. And remember, if this is your first CTF, or maybe you haven't done too many in the past, it's all about patience, persistence, and creativity. Frustration is completely normal part of the process, and it's expected, but believe me, you learn by doing it, and just try to remember to have fun with it and keep going. So we're also trying to see if we can get some Twitch streaming going, so maybe you can watch some people play a CTF, but more on that in a bit if we have some updates there. So with that being said, I want to announce and introduce our afternoon keynote, Jake Williams. He's the founder and president of Rendition Infosec. He formerly worked at the NSA, and if you're one of the few people in security who is unfamiliar with Jake Williams, there's a great New York Times article about the shadow brokers hack against the NSA and how they went after Jake after a blog posting, and it's just really, really cool read. Even if you already know Jake and know that information about him, it's just fun to look that stuff up. He's spoken at countless conferences like DEF CON, Black Hat, many, many different SANS events. He's an ongoing contributor to Infosec in general. He's always doing cutting edge talks about it. I remember just a few months ago when the Crypt32 API bug came out with Microsoft, he was jumped right on top of it and probably gave the first presentation publicly about that bug, just countless others. So I'm really excited about Jake's presentation here titled Emulating the Adversary in Post-Exploitation.
I appreciate it a lot, Stephen. Thank you so much, and long time no see. So I guess that's true for everybody now with COVID, right? Where we're not seeing everybody as much. But thanks to SANS for putting the summit together. This is fantastic, and especially making it free to the free to the overall community, or the broader community. So as Stephen mentioned, I'm Jake. I'm not going to do too much here. Obviously, I'm required to have an obligatory who am I slide, because everybody has to have one of these. But look, as far as just like thought leaders, if somebody tells you they're a thought leader, they're not. And if you have somebody that's needlessly adding blockchain to a software solution, they're also bad people. Let's just call a spade, right? That said, right, so let's talk about adversary emulation, right? Now, I want to be very clear about what we're going to talk about, what we're not going to talk about, right? I have 45 minutes here. So let's start with the what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about how to do, soup to nuts adversary emulation. That takes way more time than we have here today. And honestly, may not be, or maybe too advanced for most folks, right? What I want to talk about here is how adversaries operate after they compromise a system. After that, once they get that first hit, what do, right? Talk about they never go full cyber, a couple of warning items here, and then a couple techniques. And then of course, we'll kind of close it up and wrap it up for the rest of the day. So what are adversaries doing that we aren't, or better asked, how do we get executives to pay attention to our reports, right? There is a disconnect, a fundamental disconnect that I found at least between, executives looking at a pen test report / a red team report and those who basically them looking at that versus looking at a breach. We want to talk a little bit about that, right? Look, we all know the standard red team or pen test process. We perform an assessment, and then of course people remediate the findings immediately because they value the work that we did, right? Now, look, I want to be very clear here that I'm not going to argue about the definition for pen test versus red team versus purple team versus violet team, brown team, green team, whatever. I'm just not doing it, right? One, I don't really care, right? And maybe that's number two. Also, it's not relevant to the talk, right? There are times that this matters, right? There's times if contractually you are required to get a penetration test, well, we better have a definition of what that is and what that means in a contractual sense. But here, I'm gonna be honest, I straight up don't care, right? It literally is, our general process is perform assessment, and then remediate findings, or at least hope that somebody remediates findings, right? That's of course the goal, because otherwise, what are we even doing there, right? So you know what? On further inspections actually is missing a step, right? Anybody who's been there knows we're going to argue about the findings and severity of those findings, right? Now, I'm not saying we're going to argue because, of course, the customer's always right, but if you've been there, done that, got the T-shirt, you already know that there's that process where they say, now, hold on a second. Is that really a high? Is that really a critical? Is that really a whatever, man? Right? Of course, we all know that's part of the game, part of the play, right? Okay. So where's the disconnect come in? What is the disconnect? Why the disconnect, right? After an incident, there's rarely a case where the exploitation vectors aren't remediated, right? After an incident, right? I want to be very clear, we're talking about after an incident. I do tons of incident response. In fact, I do more incident response today personally than I do the offensive and red team work, right? I'll be honest, and I know this is sacrilege in HackFest kind of presentation. I'll tell you, I kind of enjoy it a little bit more. Don't get me wrong, I still do the root dance, right? Every time I get root, every time I pop a box, I've got my little dance kind of to do the little piece there when I get a shell. But man, at the end of the day, I'll tell you, the incident response part is a little bit more validating for me. It's a little bit more, I'm more enthusiastic about it. That said, right, these are very complementary. We're hearing a lot about purple team these days for good reason, right? We talk about purple team operations. It's red informing blue, blue informing red, and the most successful teams on both sides are ones that come together, right? So a lot of the red team techniques we use today, we steal from adversaries that we find in incident response. And during incident response, we're playing chess with the adversaries. It's not just purely forensics. Now, I want to mention here that when we do these incidents, there's rarely a case where the vectors that were exploited aren't immediately remediated, right? Now, after a pen test, though, hold on a second. How often, if you're doing a pen test, how often do you highlight something that's critical, high, whatever? My favorite one is this service account that we've had the plain text password for years with the customer. You keep going back in there, and the service account, it's still the same password, right? We know that we found it very easily. Anybody on the network could find it. We didn't have to elevate to domain admin to get any of this. It was easy, right? And it still hasn't been remediated. Right? And we're years down the road, right? Now, if an attacker uses this, I promise you, they're going to remediate that tomorrow, right? What's the disconnect, right? Well, look, first off, obviously, if I'm telling you that, a bunch of techniques we use to close that disconnect, and I'm telling you that a customer, has this for multiple years, then okay, obviously we can't do 100%, but we can level that game up, right? It's about way more than just liability. When I ask this question, where's the disconnect? Most people are like, well, it's liability, right? A pen test isn't a real thing, and you're close, but it's about more than liability, right? Listen, as humans, we are inherently loss averse. I minored in psychology back in the day. I love psychology, a ton of reading around this, behavioral economics. It will serve you well if you understand some of these principles. We are inherently loss averse, right? Meaning we will spend more to avoid a loss than to gain the same thing. They've done study after study on this. They're fascinating studies. In one, they give some half of a room a token, whatever this is, token item like a mug or whatever, and they ask the rest, they give the rest of the room some money. And in the experiment, they see how much people are willing to pay for a mug versus how much people are willing to sell a mug for. Again, these people had none of these things before, and it turns out that you are inherently loss averse because you already have that thing. Also mentioned, most humans are better at understanding tangible things than intangible counterparts. With an incident, there's a tangible loss. Even if you can't come back and monetize that loss or estimate that loss in monetary terms, there's a loss of time, there's a loss of, there's loss of reputation, et cetera. There's a tangible loss. In the average pen test report, there's a lot of technical summary of vulnerabilities, and you're leaving decision makers to spot the potential risks. You're making them do mental gymnastics to say, okay, now listen, the people I deliver the report directly to, my technical folks, they understand, they can do those gymnastics, right? But I'm not always positive that they're able to put the findings into more concrete space, and so we want to do that for them and provide that better value add, right? I want to highlight this here. Stop focusing on domain admin in your pen test report. That's it. That's the whole slide, right? I can't tell you how often folks are like, oh my gosh, I got domain admin. I was working with one of our red teamers. He just did a red team assessment where 6 different paths to domain admin. And I want to say this is way under scope, but I mean, it was a fairly small pen test scope, red team scope. And the fact that he was able to, and I'm using those terms interchangeably because in this case, it actually covered elements of both just because of the scoping and some of the stuff we had to deal with there. Bottom line, it was way, basically it was way set up there where we had the split between the red team and some of it was pen test. Bottom line, gets 6 paths to domain admin, and I was like, hey, what's the summary report finding? Like, what's the big report finding? He's like, 6 paths to domain admin, and I'm like, it's not. No, it's not at all. I mean, good job, because 6 different paths to domain admin. highlight some structural issues there, right? But what are the common pieces there, right? What are the things we're seeing here? We want to highlight the impacts, right? Now, look, we all know that we can say keys to the kingdom for domain admin, but let's be real, that doesn't really help create a concrete image for stakeholders. They either understood it or they didn't, right? If you need to know how big this disconnect is, I was working with an international firm about 2.5 years ago. And if you've been to a SANS conference with me, you may have already heard the story before, but I'll tell you, we're in the middle of basically the middle of this this engagement, and we're like, we have the we can confirm there are attackers on the domain controller, right? Now this is the CIO I'm briefing. This is not a non-technical audience, right? The guy says, hey, domain international firm. I want to be clear about this. International firm operating on 3 different continents. And I said, hey, they have the domain controller, right? They have malware on the domain. He's like, you need to back up right there. He's like, speak a little slower. He's like, is that domain controller? Is that one of the important ones? That is one of the important ones, right? And as silly as that sounds, I need you to think about the fact that had we not had that interaction, I would have assumed that he knew what I was talking about, right? We have to do better. We have to explain the impact of what we found, not say keys to the kingdom, they can steal anything, right? This is let's create tangible scenarios. Let's work through those scenarios. So this doesn't have to be done for every vulnerability we discover. We can't scale that big, but we need to create impact scenarios for some of the vulnerabilities, the ones that we know need to be addressed. And this is where you're going to do a little bit of dance with your, with your stakeholders, right? You're reporting to a technical body. There's stuff that they want to get out of a report. Work with them to make sure that you give them the ammunition that they need to get stuff fixed, right? And so this is where we start talking about impact scenarios, right? Okay, let's quickly talk about never go full cyber, because this is important. Should we completely emulate the adversary? No, definitely not. The adversary has lots of stuff that they are risks they are willing to take that we probably shouldn't be, right? Because at the end of the day, we do have a business relationship. We do have to worry about the business in general. We do have to worry about, them there, right? The attacker is willing to take risks with their client's infrastructure, whether that's internal, external, whatever. And when I say client, some folks are like, I do internal pen tests, so I don't have clients. You do. You're a service organization, right? You're providing a service to the organization, right? Internal or external, whatever that is, you have stakeholders, you have clients, right? So if you prefer stakeholder over client, whatever, but no, you shouldn't be willing to take risks, the same risks that an adversary might. Consider the impacts of reporting particularly sensitive data discovered in the course of the assessment. Oh my gosh, I have the horror story of all horror stories on this. We compromised chief counsel's machine. This guy couldn't click enough emails, couldn't click enough phishing attachments fast enough. He's like, bam, 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 bam. He's like, done, man. This was it was amazing. This was great. We originally thought we hadn't hit him successfully with the first 2 lures. He was just out of the office, right? And didn't have out of office on. And so opened up, several of these. We got shells. We're like, man, game on. And we find out this company is undergoing M&A, right? And as we went back and briefed the executive team, and we were clear, like everybody in there was executive team. We thought everybody knew that they were already in the discussions to be acquired. And it turns out that in that room of like 9 people, right, and we had briefed the CIO on this, who didn't know previous to this. He assumed he was the only one that didn't know, went into this boardroom with like 9 people, right, his executive whatever session there, and it turns out only 3 of them, now 4 with the CIO, knew that they were in talks to be acquired. We showed how compromising legal counsels and not having the, exfiltration controls in place and the whole, we're working through the scenario. We're like, if this got out, you could be, like people could short trades or they could, act on this. This is a big deal, right? And they're like, immediately we started getting questions. I'm like, yes, this is why we do impact scenarios. And the first question was, I'm sorry, we're being acquired? Right? And it was like, oh, fail, right? So we have to really consider these impacts. And this is a mea culpa story for me, right? I'm way more gun shy about stuff like this that might be regulated data or particularly sensitive data. Want to consider those impacts before we do the reporting, right? So choose wisely, right? Things you should avoid in practice that adversaries really don't think about, right? Locking out accounts a little bit, but they're pretty liberal with this. So we see attackers lock out accounts regularly. And, granted, it's not your super apex predator kind of folks, but anything that might destroy data or impact systems, I mean, that's just a gimme, right? But I mean, again, attackers are a little bit less, depending again on who you're looking at, right? They tend to be a little more liberal with this, right? STP, right? Spanning tree protocol is a fickle beast. I don't touch switches. I just don't, right? We do demonstrate impacts in a lab. I'm happy to demonstrate impacts in a lab environment, but just because you have access to a switch doesn't mean you should play with stuff. Network engineers and anybody that's been a CCNA, CCNP, they will tell you how how absolutely fickle spanning tree protocol is. And so you do not want to get involved with switching. What about exfiltrating sensitive or regulated data? Do you actually want to exfiltrate that? And the answer there is, in the vast majority of cases, no, right? If I can avoid, now if it's a question of, can we exfiltrate stuff? If the goal is to test DLP, data loss prevention, right? And can our exfiltration get through DLP? Then by all means, we'll create things. There's fake name generator, if you're not familiar with this, that will create data, fake data for you to exfiltrate, right? So social security numbers, credit cards, etc. And if it's not that kind of stuff, if there's specific keywords that the client's looking to see, if you're exfiltrating, then by all means, walk through that as part of the scenario. But I really try to avoid exfiltrating, sensitive and regulated data now. And it's not because, it's not because I don't trust my own security. It's because I don't want the liability of that, right? I don't want the liability of that. So I'll mention storage devices and controllers. Oh my gosh, be super careful with these. Again, this is another spot where, a lot of your storage engineers with the, storage area networks and SANS are just like, oh yeah, it's they get it all working, and they're like, man, I sure hope nobody breathes on that thing wrong, right? Because literally that's sometimes all it takes. We found an O-Day a few years ago, working with a client, found an O-Day and a storage controller. I'm going to leave the name of the vendor out there because it surprisingly is still not patched a couple years later. But it was an authentication bypass that got us onto the storage controller for SAN. And if you're familiar with that, you know then that you can stand up new iSCSI LUNs. You can target those LUNs. You then you're in God mode, right? This thing actually underpinned hypervisors, which is my next point. And so yes, could we have stolen data with that by creating new LUNs and all that? Oh baby, you better believe it. But am I going to do that? No, because these things are way too fickle, and I don't care how smart I think I am. I know I'm not that smart. I guess that's what it comes down to, right? Like I can look and be like, I am 99.99% sure I'm not going to break anything here, but the catastrophic impact is just too much. And then hypervisors, man, I used to think like exploiting ESX was sexy, right? It was like, heck yeah, man, I'm in God mode on the hypervisor, right? I have come to learn that those also are very fickle beasts, particularly when you have clusters and vMotion and the whole. I generally today, right, am going to avoid this pretty hard. I want to demonstrate that I can get on it by all means, but once I'm there, I'm not going to take actions that the attacker might otherwise. If you're not familiar with hypervisor exploitation, it is a really interesting topic. Once you're there, again, you're in God mode for any of the machines that are running in the hypervisor, right? You can steal the data, you can run processes, you can dump memory. It's just amazing, right? But I want to be super careful around that too, because I don't want to break stuff, right? It's kind of my cardinal rule: first, do no harm. Right? So now that we talked about what to do kind of from a reporting standpoint, how can we really up our game? Let's get to the technical side of this, right? So some techniques that we have for doing post-exploitation and kind of following along with what the adversary does in post-exploitation, right? This isn't all of it. Again, like I mentioned, I had 45 minutes. I got, we'll go half an hour, 25 minutes now. I want to discuss these techniques, right? Look at the data the user already has access to. This is number one because it requires no pivoting and no escalation. Right? It's literally abusing what the attacker has access to. By the way, if you have a client, right, by the way, when you're doing scoping, if you don't ask the client what it is that they want to get out of the report, you are cheating the client. That's all there is to it, right? Your stakeholder, ask them what they want to get out of the report. It's going to help you target stuff. It's going to help you understand how to write that report and how to process the data. If they're trying to get UBA in place and try to get justification for UBA, this is phenomenal, right? Because what you're doing here effectively is looking like an insider, right? I mean, yes, you don't have all the knowledge of the insider, but you have the access of the insider. UBA is one of the few things that catches this, right? And so again, knowing what they want to do, knowing what my stakeholders are trying to justify, what they're trying to get budget for, is going to help me generate these reports, right? I want to go hunt for the most sensitive documents, right? I'll give you a trick for this. Target backups, compromise source code, plant web shells, and dump Wi-Fi and VPN configurations. Let's talk about each of these in series, right? So talking about pivoting to user accessible data, right? You landed on that first phishing email, you got shell, right? Should you immediately pivot? This depends on who you are, right? It depends on the security of the network. And again, it depends on the goals of what you want to get out of, basically get out of something here, right? I'll tell you that I still hold the same rule, 2 is 1, 1 is none. If you're not familiar with this, look it up. But it has to do with you lose your shell quickly. So by all means, I want to get a second entry vector, but then I'm going to absolutely look at what does the user already have mapped, right? And this literally is as simple as net use or get PS drive, right? Certainly some of your implants may have functionality for this, right? To be able to look at this, but it is basically get PS Drive or NetUse and look at what shares they already have mapped. I tell you, my favorite share, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I always go for the, I always go look at the, whatever if it says secret. Now if it says secret or accounting data or HR data, yeah, I'm jumping over there, right? But like, if the share doesn't make sense to me, whatever the share name is, but there's one that says public, oh buddy, I am going for that public share. That is absolutely an awesome cornucopia of nastiness in most organizations, because what ends up happening is, right, is that folks come in and they say, hey, I need to get a new share created or new group created or whatever. And if you work with some outsourcing, like some of these managed service providers, Tata is a great example. I'm not knocking Tata here, right? But Tata Consulting or Communications or whatever it is, TCS, basically their SLA for the normal, the normal support plan to get a new security group created, right, is 3 weeks, right? I know this through a client, right? It's 3 weeks to get a security group created. Can you imagine trying to work around that from an availability / operational standpoint? Are you going to wait 3 weeks, or are you going to go dump it in the public share that everybody has access to? And the answer is the latter. We all know how users really work. And the amount of stuff that we find, amazingly sensitive stuff that we find in the public share, game on, it outpaces practically everything else that we find. I don't know I say in every case, but it's one of those that I'm going to go to. So I want to start here. And again, me poking around in these different folders, and I record what we're doing. Not always screen record, but we always take timed notes. By the way, if you're not familiar, in Notepad, hitting the F5 key throws a timestamp in there. So like you immediately can keep great notes of like what you did when. Again, if you're using Cobalt Strike or some of these other frameworks, they'll do some of that for you as well. But we want to come back then and basically be able to show, again, like, hey, we poked around in here for an hour and a half. This is way atypical. And any insider that was doing this as well, if you didn't notice us, you're not going to notice them. And we're able to formulate that into report language for good justification for UEBA, right? I may also want to look at recently accessed documents, right? I'm not going to say these are the most important. They're not, right? I'm going to talk about that separately, targeting the most important documents. But I do want to see what a user used recently. This is particularly good for, basically for like legal counsel or, less so for my task users, right? Than the folks that are, and again, certainly use your judgment here. But I can literally reg query, and I can see a list of users' recent documents they've looked at, and there's a master list, and then there's a list by, as you can kind of see up here, by suffix. I'll tell you something that's been phenomenal on this too, is if you type into the Windows search bar, right? So like if you're in the Windows search bar and you type, that actually, the search terms actually show up as recent docs, which is now just, I'm not having to dump browser history or whatever again. And if you think I'm like, why am I focusing on users and data and not like, how many systems did you pwn? Where did you get domain admin? Because I've been on the other side of the keyboard, right? Your attackers, right? They're fundamentally collecting, that they're performing intelligence collection missions, right? And so, when it comes down to it, I say attackers, not all of them, right? But the vast, I say vast, APT style, right? That's what they're doing, right? And so they're going after data, right? Domain admin, it's just a means to an end, right? Financially motivated attackers, same thing. They're just looking for, they're basically looking for different data than in most cases, right? That we might see through Intel. And so I can dump this and I can see, hey, what's the user looking at like right now? Now, if you want to go steal the registry hive, it's locked open, so you need something like raw copy or sleuthkit to be able to go pull that off of the, basically out from under the NTFS file system. But as we look here, you basically see it looks like a bunch of blob data, but it really is just, it's hex encoded Unicode is it, right? And so there's like stupid simple Python here to literally be able to go and print that. If you want to print each character in sequence, that's what I've got here. And then that's what I've got basically here in this first print. But then here at the end, literally, we're just jamming in everything into that file name. And you can see there's much sexier decoding you can do, but this is all the Python you need to be able to basically see those documents, right? Well, that's actually pretty valuable for me to be able to go back and say, okay, what were they working on? What have they been interested in? Because I don't know my target the way they know themselves. This is getting a chance to see their recent behavior, right? And this is something that I absolutely want to do because it may point me to documents I didn't know I was interested in previously. It may point me to data I didn't know I was interested in previously. And by the way, just even showing this in the background and saying like, hey, we had access to this, this, and this. It's not saying we had access to files. We're saying, hey, we were following that legal work you were doing on that case, blah, 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 right, with the chief counsel, whatever that happens to be. That's concrete, right? Notice again, I'm separating between the abstract and the concrete, right? So what about hunting for the most sensitive documents? Sometimes I drop onto a share and I'm like, man, there are thousands or tens of thousands of documents and I can't exfiltrate them all, and I shouldn't, right? Even if I could, I shouldn't, right? Also, saying we were able to access thousands of documents probably won't communicate impact, because in most cases, the client forgot they were there, or if they didn't forget, they have no idea what's in them, right? And so I don't have time to open lots of documents, because to open it, I have to exfiltrate it unless I'm on RDP, right? Unless I've compromised a system and I'm like RDP'd in. You know, I don't have that kind of time, right? So what I need is a better mousetrap, right? And it turns out that better mousetrap is Tika. If you're not familiar with Tika, this is like the takeaway from the talk, right? So love Tika. We can't natively read Office documents. If you're familiar with the new school Office documents, anything with an X behind it, right? The PPTX, they're really a zip file, right? And they have images and a bunch of XML data and a bunch of, you know, how to render the document all embedded there. Tika is awesome, right? Because once you get Tika into the environment, it's huge. It sucks, right? It's 70 megs, right? But you know, with bandwidth these days, 70 megs doesn't really mean what it used to, right? And yes, it requires Java, right? So Java needs to be there. It doesn't have to be installed, right? You can actually bring a JRE with you. And I think the JRE now is, I can't remember, like the portable JRE is sitting at maybe another 100 megs or something, right? So not horrible, right? But basically here, what we can do is, instead of, you'll note here in the, you'll note here originally that I said, well, basically type out that, emulating the adversary, and look for the word exfil. And then I said, hey, let's run it through Tika, right? And sure enough, Tika finds it, right? And that's what I want to highlight here, is that Tika is literally converting all of this to text, right? And so if I know what I'm supposed to be looking for, text in the documents, this is an outstanding tool for figuring out where those high impact documents are. Again, I want to take this out of the abstract. We could access lots of documents. Great. Listen, you had domain admin, you could access it all. We got it, right? 6 paths to domain admin, right? You could access everything. Check Roger, we're good, right? But taking something like Tika, we can come in and find the true keys to the kingdom. What would really highlight the biggest business impact? Believe me, we ask this every time. Now, sometimes people are like, you figure it out. Okay, good to go. We'll figure it out, right? But understand, of course, that attackers have more time, they have more budget, right, than we typically have time, budgeted for a red team assessment or a pen test. And so anything we can do to kind of move us along, right, basically, and again, this isn't providing us any additional help. What we're saying is like, hey, move us to tell us what would hurt you the worst. What's going to create that impact the worst, right? Or the best, I should say the worst, the best with your stakeholders. And so again, if we know those terms, we can use Tika to go find and confirm access to those, to documents that contain those things, right? And by the way, this totally prevents the client from wondering, does this matter, right? The answer then is yes, it matters, right? So game on. What about backups? Target your backup servers. Target backup servers. I can't tell you how many of these we found with open iSCSI endpoints. And I have to tell you, this made me laugh super hard when it came to Hacking Team. If you're not familiar with Hacking Team, I'll be in Slack after this. I'll be in Slack to answer questions after this presentation's done. But happy to, I'll drop the link to the Hacking Team thing in there. They actually, the hacker who compromised them, I believe it was Phineas, posted a kind of a walkthrough of how they did it, right? And a big piece of that was backups, right? So it's iSCSI and backups, right? Port 3260, by the way, if you're not familiar. Not that I have a reason to know that, right? Not that we ever use that, right? But 3260. Anyway, so when you find a backup, don't make it about the data you have, right? Don't say, oh my gosh, we got backups and we could have had anything. Go find actual data that's of interest. I will tell you that one of the things that we have found that drives a point home, that really drives impact home, is saying, oh yeah, with the server backups, we were able to go download, and this is such a great test, right? To say, oh, we could download a backup. Now, should you really download a backup? No, you probably shouldn't, right? A full machine backup. I don't want that liability generally, right? But it's a great demonstration, right? So you can say, hey, look, we had access to the backups, and we're able to, with those, we can clone and run one of these servers. This is something I usually talk to folks about on-prem, and kind of work. Again, this is, you'll notice that I'm talking about a lot of collaboration, right, with IT stakeholders, right, as well as information security stakeholders, and that's because there is, right. We really try to keep that collaboration going throughout these, particularly the red team assessments, right. So, what about compromising source code, right? Oh my gosh, if you can hit source code, oh buddy. Right? Listen, there's two pieces here, right? First off, in the majority of organizations, if they have source code for applications, for the majority of organizations, they have source code in their apps. Typically, that is their intellectual property. That is a core piece of their intellectual property, right? You know, I for instance, will talk to folks and we're, you know, for instance, a trading firm, right? I was working with a trading firm a while back, and then I said, what's your, you know, what truly is the keys to the kingdom here for your, you know, for your trading firm? And oh, without a doubt, it has to be the customer database. And I'm like, is it really? Is it really? Right? And they're like, well, of course it is. And I was like, I don't think it is, right? You know, I said, with all due respect, I think that your customer database is really not the keys to the kingdom, right? I think what truly the keys to the kingdom is, it's all your, basically, it's your high frequency trading algorithms, right? And your analytics algorithms. I think those are your keys to the kingdom. Would you publish those? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, how badly would you impact it if you lost your, you know, if you lost your customer database? And it would impact us heavily. I'm like, that's cool. I said, can anybody copy your business? If you gave me your customer database and I was able to contact all of them and offer them 5% cheaper prices, right? Would that be you know, would that put you out of business? And they're like, no. And I'm like, why not? And they're like, well, they don't have the same market research and the same. I was like, is it the market research? Well, they don't really understand how we do our trading. I'm like, exactly, right? But what will tell them how you do your trading is your algorithms, right? Because, and I know there's humans sitting behind some of this, but bear in mind, again, this is a huge piece of intellectual property. So if you can steal that source code, game on. This is a big business impact for most organizations, right? So developer machines for the win. I tell you, one of the great things about developers is they almost always have debug rights, even if they're not local admin on their machines. And I think this is hilarious, right? Because as Stephen will tell you, as most folks around will tell you, if a developer has debug rights on their machine, their admin already, they just haven't asked for it. Right? Meaning they can take local admin anytime they want. Microsoft's pretty explicit about that too, by the way, right? Debug rights could be used to elevate privileges, whatever. There's like a little asterisk warning kind of thing. They talk about debug rights. But then there's the scary part, right? So yes, somebody was on the source code repository, and this is one of the things that we talk about from an impact standpoint, right? It's not just that we could have stolen it. It's not just that we can take away that intellectual property. It's the, what does the cleanup look like, right? And this is something that we try to highlight. It's the, if an attacker places rogue source code or rogue code in your source tree, A, would you detect it, right? Because we're in position to do it. We were in position to do it, right? Would they detect it? And that was A. And then B, how would they know? How would they find it, right? Suppose that they later find, they don't detect that initial code insertion. Suppose that then they later find that their development environment was compromised, multiple developers are compromised. How do you unroll that? Right? How do you go back in and say, let's go hunt for a backdoor, right? Because backdoors, if you've done source code review looking for an intentionally placed backdoor, they are wicked difficult to discover. They are wicked difficult to discover. In fact, there have been competitions about people creating backdoors that are hard to discover. So we've demonstrated changing source code on a few occasions. I've got one of the recorded sessions up here. It's the one that we, it's an example that we can show. But we've done this for a couple of corporate clients, and one made it all for a commercial software platform, made it all the way through the build process, and they stopped it there. Right? They intentionally, like that was the goal of the test, right? Stopped at the build process, right? Stopped it at made it through the build process, was going into QA for distribution, and like, done, it's too close, right? This thing with the backdoor obviously can't go out to our customer base. But this is huge, right? And then of course, if you've got source code, look for hard-coded passwords. Those are dying out. I don't see those much anymore, but API keys all the time, right? Should those be hard-coded? No, but sometimes for internal apps, stuff gets hard-coded that maybe shouldn't be, right? You got some back-end stuff or middleware pure that has API keys, that, stuff that may not get published to an end user, right? Okay, what about web shells? Web shells are difficult to detect, right? Anybody who tells you otherwise is lying to you. Now, look, if you're dealing with China Chopper or some of these, classic go-to, web shells, okay, yes, those are easier to detect, but why? Because they follow, one, they're noisy as all get out, right? Two, that they follow well-understood patterns, right? So well-understood patterns, we understand the signatures around those, that's it, right? But I'm going to tell you, post-breach, the effort done for web shells, beyond just simple cursory examination, this gets to be a significant expense if the organization doesn't know what good looks like in their code base. And I'm going to tell you now, few of them do. Stakeholders, they detest uncertainty, right? Listen, the thing that drives markets downward has very little to do with profit, right? Very little to do with profit. It has to do with uncertainty, right? Uncertainty makes investors, you can tell somebody bad news, and that's not as important as giving them, like, I don't know, right? They'd rather hear the bad news than I don't know. And here saying, I know my web shells were taken care of, people flat out don't know. It is a hard thing fundamentally to do, right? So even in cases where we have a refined build and deploy system, typically these are DevOps kind of shops, in places where they have refined build systems, it is not easy to redeploy an entire web application, right? Or cheap, right? I'll mention here that, if you have a spot where you had an outage, this is, again, we're working collaboratively, right? If you had an outage previously where you had to go and redeploy some of that infrastructure, rebuild some of that infrastructure, talk about the impact there, and then mention that again, what we're talking about here is significantly higher in most cases, right? Significantly higher than a simple outage, right? We have confidence in the case of a redeploy, for a normal outage, we have confidence in our infrastructure, right? We have confidence in our code base, right? In this scenario, we may not have either, right? And so there's a lot that goes into that, and it really is. I'll just say it's tough, right? The other thing I'll mention here, as far as web shells go, is that in most cases, anytime you'd have had access to plan a web shell, you probably also had access to basically to change existing files, right? And so it's easy to demonstrate a modification that logs plain text usernames and passwords to a text file. That's actually the one that we use, or the one that we show in basically compromising basically a web app or development web app. Don't do this, by the way, in production. Just don't, right? There's all kinds of non-repudiation issues here. Even if you're like, don't worry, I've got it taken care of, I'm just using the passwords for lateral movement or whatever. I generally think this is a bad plan. By all means, you do you, right? This is a risk we would discuss with, particularly if they're not, if they're not known to be, let's say it's an e-commerce type platform or a customer-facing platform, having the passwords of employees is one thing, right? They kind of agreed to that scope. The customers, not so much, right? And so we really don't want to get into that kind of liability scenario. Even though you can do it, don't. What we have done in the past is we've created a secondary login page, right? And given it some random name. That does two things, right? One, we can show and kind of demonstrate that, basically that we can modify by copying the original login page and giving it the xyx12815.aspx, right? And now we're modifying that say login.php to aspx, whatever. You get the idea, whatever the framework is, right? You can then go in and modify the page, right? And modify the code there. And then, you're doing two things here. One, you've shown you can drop a file into the web of the application, right? And that's not noticed, right? If it's not noticed, eek, right? So you're showing there basically the ability to do those modifications, to drop those files, et cetera. And so I find that communicates the impact, and you can walk them through the impact without actually impacting them, right? We don't want to create a breach in the middle of a pen test. An e-commerce application, you do the same modifications for credit card numbers, you can exfiltrate session IDs, et cetera, right? And then you have Wi-Fi and VPN configurations, right? Look, I love VPN configurations. Hunting those is fun, and certainly I'll dump those, but there's nothing universal to do that, right? You dump Wi-Fi configurations, that makes it personal. Particularly if you know who your stakeholders are, right? If we know who we're briefing, like up the chain, not the people that hired us directly, but the people up the chain, we love to go after them unless they're out of scope, right? Because it makes it very real to them to know that an attacker was on their machine, they didn't detect it, et cetera. I'll also mention that most workers have connected their laptops to home Wi-Fi, and demonstrating you can dump their Wi-Fi configs, including passwords for their home networks. That gets attention quick. Gets attention really, really quick, right? And so you can see here, this is one that I pushed. This, no joke, is my actual home Wi-Fi is eternally blue. The little play on that wonderful nastiness that cut across the internet. But no joke here. Again, as you look at something like this, what we're trying to take, is Wi-Fi the biggest deal there? I mean, look, corporate Wi-Fi, great, right? By all means, yes. But a lot of them are not using just basic, pre-shared keys. A lot of times there's WPA enterprise, authentication involved there. But my big key here is I'm trying to make sure that we have basically a scenario where we're trying to make it more personal back to that stakeholder, right? If you go back to what were they looking at, right, in the first place, so those documents they were looking at, again, the recent docs key I showed you there, that's another one that, again, really drives that point home because it's personal, it's targeting them, right? Yes, I know once you get domain admin, you had all this anyway. That's not the point. We're trying to make sure that people stand up and pay attention from a work standpoint. By the way, too, if there's a question of do attackers dump Wi-Fi and VPN configs, of course they do, right? I mean, Of course they do, I guess is all I can say there. Closing thoughts. I'm going to go and wrap this up because I've got a whopping, it looks like 3 or 4 minutes left. I'll just say emulating the adversary and post-exploitation is something that helps stakeholders understand impact. We have got to stop. I know I've said it like 3 times now, but we have to stop focusing on domain admin. Have to stop this for domain admin in our pen test. We have to. We really have to go in and highlight basically we have to go in and highlight the actual impact of what we're doing. Unlike traditional adversary emulation, this doesn't require substantial CTI resources. What do I mean by this? When we do red teaming, in traditional red teaming, because it looks like I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to take this time to say, in traditional red teaming, that there's 2 types of it that we really do, right, for full red team operations. One's threat emulation, the other one's adversary emulation. Threat emulation, and I know people argue with me to death about what is and isn't red team, but whatever. From the threat emulation standpoint, what we're doing there effectively is it's everything in the kitchen sink, right? It's if you've got a technique, use the technique, game on, right? That's threat emulation, right? Adversary emulation, red teamers really typically don't like this. With adversary emulation, we're taking a specific adversary. We're then saying, what techniques do they use, right? So let's say APT22, right? There's a Chinese APT group. What techniques do they use? What types of malware do they use? What are the characteristics of that malware? And you may not have their malware, their implants, all their tools, but we understand for at least, even for the closed source tools that they have, the stuff that's proprietary to them, we understand the types of residue that they leave behind. We're going to use those same tools and techniques and leave that same residue behind. The goal there is that we're emulating a specific adversary, right? So one that we have in our threat model and testing those defenses. A lot of folks jump right into threat emulation because, to be honest, it's easier. It doesn't require cyber threat intel resources, because one of the first questions that some of our red teamers ask is, well, how would I know what APT22 does, right? Well, ask CTI. They know. That's what they do, right? So CTI is going to help you with this, right? But if you don't have a good CTI team, it's hard to do this from the get-go. That said, honestly, most orgs benefit more from adversary emulation than they do from threat emulation, because you want to, if you fail at adversary, at detecting adversary emulation, you'll fail at threat emulation too, fail detecting it, right? So anyway, bottom line here, I want to choose my actions carefully. This is the don't go full cyber, because I don't want to negatively impact security, but I do want to demonstrate impact, right? That's the big key. If you've heard me say it once, I'm going to say it 100 times. It's demonstrate impact, right? And wow, I think that's all I've got, and I think I've hit that time, right? So I'm going to be in Slack after this, and I will happily answer questions around that. Actually, do I have 1 minute left? I have 2 minutes left. Do I really see many threat actors, and most being remote over the internet, dumping Wi-Fi settings? Have I seen a lot of attackers dump Wi-Fi settings? That's a really good one. I have seen a couple of folks do that, right? I will mention that if you have without getting too crazy here, you never know where you're going to need access next, right? And so depending on the type of attacker you're looking at, right? Nation statey type stuff. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to cut off here. Steve, thank you so much for having me. SANS, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate everybody's time. Like I said, I'll hop into Slack here in just a minute.
Thanks, Jake. You've definitely got a lot of questions. A ton of banter was going on in the channel, so it was great to watch that, and very fun presentation. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that 2 more times, I think. But thank you so much. And yeah, you've probably got like 20 questions, so I would say if you've got a question for Jake, go ahead over into the hallway and start asking those questions again, even if you already typed it up, so we can make sure everybody gets the questions answered. But thanks again, Jake.